We now move on to section 2, the value streams and process dimension for this practice. For the exam, we need to understand and apply the processes of the practice. Particularly, we need to remember and understand the inputs and outputs of all the processes and describe the key activities of the processes. And from an application perspective, we need to know how to integrate the practice into the organization's value streams, which means you need to pay attention to the processes with their inputs, activities, and outputs, and clearly understand each of the steps in each process to answer those questions in the exam. Whereas for the value stream analysis, you need to understand it so that you can apply what you learned in the exam. I sometimes find application questions a little easier than the understanding and remembering questions. Processes. There are 3 processes in the service configuration management practice. If you recollect, we had 2 practice success factors, but we have 3 processes. The first one, managing a common approach to service configuration management. Second, capturing and managing and providing configuration information. Third, verifying the configuration information. So let's move on to understand these 3 processes and the detail within each one of them. Now, before we start, a process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that transform inputs into outputs. A process takes one or more defined inputs and turns them into defined outputs. Processes define the sequence of actions and their dependencies. So the first one here is managing a common approach to service configuration management. And this process is focused on establishing an effective and efficient approach to the management of configuration information in the organization. This information aspect is the most important in this practice. So we see several inputs, several activities, and several outputs. Now, I may be able to read them one by one, which I will do anyway, but I highly recommend that you take a look at these few times, because you may have a question in the exam, and as you can see in the sample papers, there are questions about such as which of the entries are not an input or are an input for this process or any other process. And similarly, there can be some question about the detail behind one of these activities here for this or other processes, or any question about a certain output from any of these processes. So because an approach is needed for this configuration information to be managed, therefore, lots of general information would become inputs, such as it's at an organization level, therefore organization architecture, how the business runs, etc., stakeholder needs, organization structure, the various services and products that the organization develops and delivers and maintains, which is the portfolios. Then there may be monitoring data, the service monitoring data, and various practice records of this practice, organization policies, external regulations, and standards become inputs. The key outputs would be the service configuration management approach, also the CMDB, it's actually a separate entry, then the service configuration management communications to be done, and the knowledge management materials are also created, then the request for change and the implementation initiatives based on those requests for changes, then the service management configuration management approach, performance reports as to how the approach is performing. And the activities are 4 here. First of all, analyze stakeholder requirements. We will be going into detail on each one of these. Define and agree the service configuration management approach, then communicate and integrate the service configuration management approach into the organization's value streams, and review and adjust the service configuration management approach and procedures. So this is a depiction of this process. It's also possible in the exam that you may have questions related to specific outputs for specific activities rather than the overall outputs of the process. And we can see here in the 3rd step, wherein communicate and integrate the approach into the organization's value streams, the specific outputs are, this is where the outputs really come out, the service configuration management approach, the communications and knowledge management materials, and the CMDB is established. And in the last step, review and adjust the service configuration management approach and procedures. There are requests for changes and certain implementation initiatives for the configuration management practice and service configuration management approach and performance reports. So the performance reports related to the approach are also created. But let's get a better understanding of all this. So in the first step, wherein stakeholder requirements are being analyzed, the configuration manager, and we will see this role afterwards in the organization dimension and people dimension, they have the overall accountability for this practice. And they're not a practice owner. A practice owner may be different, but ITIL doesn't define or describe practice owners. So practice owners may have overall accountability. Configuration management have the highest responsibility in this practice. So they identify the key stakeholders who expect the configuration information and requirements. And these stakeholders can be usually practice owners, value stream owners, product owners, service owners, resource owners, project managers, and so on. And then once these key stakeholders are identified and their requirements are gathered in this step, they are prioritized, they are documented, and this is where configuration coordinators, librarians, and external consultants may also be involved. And this is where the configuration management, the manager forms a team from all those involved so that the work can proceed. The second step is to define and agree the service configuration management approach. This team that has been formed, they discuss and agree the overall approach or plan. By approach, what we mean that it should describe the service configuration management policies. We'll come to that in a moment. It should describe the CI types, the taxonomy or the notations, and the lifecycle models, the naming and labeling conventions, the automation and integration aspects, how the CI would be identified, what are specific activities, targets, and KPIs for that, and the roles and responsibilities, monitoring and ongoing control procedures. And we'll also see in the next slide, we have verification procedures, reporting procedures to be defined, configuration discovery and reporting procedures, and the funding and cost allocations also to be understood. And when it comes to policies, the policies will be several, such as policies for assessing the relevance of the configuration information and planning the CMDB, policies for the optimization of the costs of the service configuration information, policies for verification of the CMDB data, policies for integration of the various practice activities into the organization's value streams and practices, and policies for how and when the approach should be reviewed. Also, another decision which happens in this step of defining and agreeing the approach is to understand or agree which CI attributes need to be included into the scope of this, and whether these attributes should be updated automatically or manually. So all this is discussed and approved by the key stakeholders. Then the third step is to communicate and integrate the service configuration management approach into the organization's value stream. This is where the real work of implementing the whole thing happens. So the agreed approach is communicated to and discussed with the stakeholders. These typically include practitioners who will be participating in the practice activities like technical experts and others. And stakeholders will decide about the training of this practice activities and procedures. And there'll be formal initial training and periodic awareness training as well. The approach is implemented also in this step. And this is where many other practices come into play, such as IT asset management, supplier management, change enablement, project management, OCM, the workforce and talent management, OCM meaning organizational change management. Then we have relationship management, infrastructure and platform management, software development and management, and many other practices as relevant. Then the last step is to review and adjust the approach and the procedures to make sure that everything is implemented and communicated well. This is where the service configuration manager monitors and reviews the adoption, compliance, and effectiveness of the agreed approach and the procedures. So this can be done periodically at certain intervals. So it can be done event-based. Event meaning there could be certain requests for information, certain new type or new types of requests, and there may be some gaps identified during audits or verifications of the CMDB and the CMS, or whenever there are some certain new requirements coming up. So at that time, the review can occur and then the approach can be adjusted. Now, there should be some performance reports about the approach, how it is working, so that decisions can be made whether to update the approach or not.